The banquet hall smelled like garlic bread and candle wax, and my father's wine glass was already on its third refill when he stood up to give the toast. It was 7:52 p.m. on a Friday in October, 16 hours before my wedding, and I remember the exact temperature of the room because someone had cranked the air conditioning too high, and I could see goosebumps on my mother's arms 3 seats down. My father tapped his fork against his glass, smiled at the room, and said the sentence that would end up costing him more than he could have imagined. "I just hope you know what you're getting, Naomi. A broke nobody in a 15-year-old truck." 42 people went quiet at once. But here's what none of them knew that night, including my father, who was smiling wider than anyone in the room. His own bank statements were about to become the actual headline of this wedding, not mine. Welcome back to Home of Secrets. I'm Naomi Reyes, 29, a fraud and risk compliance analyst at a regional bank in Charleston, South Carolina. This is the story of how my father humiliated the man I love in front of both our families the night before our wedding, and how a routine file crossing my desk 3 weeks later turned out to hold the exact numbers that would unravel everything he'd built his whole image on. If you've ever had someone underestimate the person you love out loud, in public, at the worst possible moment, stay with me. This one has a very specific kind of ending. My father built Reyes Builders from a single flatbed truck and a business loan he took out the year I was born, and by the time I was in elementary school, he had turned it into the kind of company that sponsored the community Little League team and got its name printed on the back of church bulletins. He was proud of that company in a way that occasionally looked, from a distance, like being proud of himself. He wore it like a suit. Success, in my house growing up, was never a feeling. It was a performance, and my father was always performing it. For neighbors, for clients, for relatives who visited twice a year and needed to leave impressed. I remember a specific Christmas when I was 10, when my father bought my mother a car she had never asked for and didn't particularly want. A car too large for her to comfortably park, with leather seats she found too warm in summer, because a competing contractor in town had just bought his wife one exactly like it, and my father could not, under any circumstances, be seen coming in second. My mother drove that car for 6 years, quietly, without complaint, the way she quietly did most things that didn't belong to her, but had been given to her anyway, as part of someone else's story. I was the kid who noticed everything and said very little about it. I noticed that our above-ground pool got replaced with an in-ground one. The same summer, a rumor went around the neighborhood that Reyes Builders had lost its biggest commercial contract. I noticed that my father bought a new truck almost every 18 months, always at the exact moment something at the company seemed to be going quietly wrong. I was 12 the first time I heard the word overextended through a heating vent, my parents arguing in hushed, careful voices at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, and 13 the first time I understood that the word meant something closer to, "We have less than it looks like we have." My mother, Elaine, spent 30 years managing the gap between what my father had and what my father wanted people to believe he had. She did it quietly, the way some people manage chronic pain, not by fixing the source, but by learning exactly how to move around it without making it worse. I grew up watching her do that math in real time, at dinner parties, at church, at my own middle school graduation, where my father showed up 40 minutes late in a brand new truck and told everyone in earshot that he'd been closing a 7-figure deal, when the truth, which I only learned years later, was that he'd been at the bank trying to negotiate a missed loan payment. There is one memory from that same year that I've never told anyone, not even Marcus, until I sat down to put this story together. My father took me, just the two of us, to the grand opening of a strip mall Reyes Builders had constructed, and introduced me to the mayor as the future of the company, a title I hadn't asked for and didn't want, delivered with the same performative warmth he gave everything. I remember standing next to him in a dress my mother had bought on clearance, watching him shake hands with men in suits, and understanding, even at 13, that I was a prop in that photo, not a daughter. One more detail in the set dressing of a man who needed, always, to look like he had more than he had. I went to college on scholarships and worked 2 jobs to cover the rest. Not because my father couldn't have helped. He could have, on paper, but because every time money moved in our house, it moved toward the appearance of success rather than the actual foundation of it. I studied finance at the College of Charleston specifically, if I'm honest, because I wanted to understand the difference between the two. I wanted to be able to look at a set of numbers and know immediately whether they were telling the truth or performing it. I met Marcus the way people meet each other now, at a coffee shop, both of us reading actual paperback books instead of looking at our phones, which felt like enough of a coincidence to say something about. He was a high school shop teacher, 31 years old, who spent his weekends building furniture out of reclaimed cedar in a garage workshop he'd built himself, board by board, over 3 winters. He drove a truck that was, at the time we met, exactly 11 years old, with a dent in the tailgate he refused to fix because, he said, it reminded him of the summer he'd used the truck to help his best friend move into a first apartment. Marcus didn't perform anything. He didn't need to. He had a modest, steady salary, a small savings account he'd been feeding for a decade without missing a single month, and the kind of calm that comes from a person who has never once needed anyone to be impressed with him. On our 3rd date, Marcus told me, unprompted, exactly how much he had in savings, exactly how much his student loans still owed, and exactly what his monthly budget looked like, down to the line item he'd set aside for wood. I remember sitting across from him, stunned into silence for a moment, because I had never once in my life heard a man talk about money the way he did, plainly, without shame, without performance, the way you'd read someone a weather report. I told him, later that night, that it was the most honest conversation about money I'd ever had with anyone, including my own parents. He just shrugged and said, "It's just numbers. I don't know why people make it a personality." I fell in love with him slowly, and then all at once, the way you fall in love with someone who has nothing to prove. 2 years before the wedding, I found out, almost by accident, in the specific way most important discoveries happen, that Reyes Builders was 6 weeks from defaulting on its main operating line of credit. I found out because my mother mentioned, offhand, during a phone call, that the bank had asked my father for updated collateral documentation, and something in her voice made me pull the thread. In my line of work, I know exactly what that kind of request usually means. I did some quiet digging of my own, not through my employer, since Reyes Builders didn't bank with us, but through public UCC filings and a call to a friend who worked loan servicing at my father's actual bank, someone who owed me a favor and was careful enough to speak only in general terms. what I learned was this. If that credit line defaulted, the collateral behind it included my parents' house, my mother's house, the house she had spent 30 years quietly holding together. I didn't tell my father I knew. I didn't tell my mother either at first, because I understood, the way you understand your own family's specific rules without anyone stating them, that knowing would have required someone to say the truth out loud, and my father had never once, in my entire life, said a hard truth out loud when a comfortable performance was available instead. Instead, over the following 14 months, I quietly paid down $60,000 of that credit line myself, in a series of payments rooted through a small family trust my grandmother had left me, structured carefully enough that it read, to anyone glancing at the paperwork, like a routine refinance the bank had approved. It took most of the savings I had been building since my first job out of college, savings that, in another version of this story, might have gone toward a house of my own, or the wedding I was now 3 weeks from having. I didn't do it for praise. I didn't even do it entirely for my father. I did it because I could not, professionally or personally, watch my mother lose the one steady thing she had spent 3 decades protecting. My father never asked where the refinance had come from. He mentioned it once, at a Sunday dinner, saying the bank had finally come to their senses about extending him better terms. I passed him the mashed potatoes and said nothing. If you've ever quietly protected someone who has no idea they're being protected, you already know exactly how strange that dinner felt. Around that same time, Marcus and I got engaged, on a Tuesday evening in his workshop, with sawdust still on his hands, using a ring box he had made himself out of the same cedar he built everything from. My father's reaction, when we told him, was to ask, within the first 2 minutes, what Marcus's 5-year plan was, and whether teaching paid anything real. I remember watching Marcus answer calmly, without a trace of defensiveness, that he was doing exactly what he wanted to be doing, and that his 5-year plan was simply to keep doing it well. My father nodded in the specific way he nodded at things he'd already decided not to respect. At Thanksgiving that year, my father made a point, in front of my aunt and uncle, of asking Marcus how the whole shop teacher thing was going, then turned to the table and said, "I keep telling Naomi she could do better, but she's stubborn like her mother." He laughed like it was a joke. Nobody else laughed. My uncle changed the subject to football, the way men in my family have always changed the subject when something true has landed too heavily in the room. Marcus, for his part, simply said, "It's going great. Thanks for asking," and passed the cranberry sauce. And I remember loving him fiercely in that exact moment, for refusing to give my father the reaction he was fishing for. Over the following months, my father found small, repeated ways to mention Marcus's truck, Marcus's salary, Marcus's modest little garage hobby, always with a smile, always phrased just gently enough that objecting to it would have made me the unreasonable one. At my engagement dinner, hosted at a restaurant my father chose specifically because it was expensive, he raised a toast that included the phrase "opposites attract," delivered with a laugh that made 3 relatives laugh along, and made my stomach turn. I let it go. I always let it go. I had spent an entire childhood learning exactly how much it cost to correct my father in front of an audience, and the answer was always more than it was worth, until eventually it wasn't. 6 months before the wedding, my father invited Marcus to lunch alone, without me, which surprised me enough that I asked Marcus, afterward, how it went. Marcus told me, evenly, that my father had spent most of the lunch describing a boat he was thinking of buying, a fishing charter he'd taken with a client, and a golf membership he was considering at a club the right people belonged to, before finally asking Marcus, almost as an afterthought, whether he had any actual savings, or if teaching just about covered the truck payment. Marcus told him the truth, that he had no truck payment at all, having paid it off years earlier, and that his savings were healthy and entirely his own. My father, according to Marcus, changed the subject immediately, back to the boat. Marcus told me this story without any anger in his voice at all, which somehow made me angrier on his behalf than if he'd been furious himself. If you've ever watched someone you love absorb small, repeated insults with more grace than the person delivering them deserved, you already know exactly how that lunch sat with me for weeks afterward. The rehearsal dinner was held at a banquet hall my father had insisted on paying for, over my objections, because he said it needed to look right. Given that he'd invited, among the usual guests, a developer named Walter Grissom, a man Reyes Builders had been trying for 8 months to land as a client for a $12 million mixed-use project downtown. I hadn't fully understood, until that night, exactly how much my father was hoping this wedding weekend would double as a showcase. Not for me, not really, but for Reyes Builders, for the version of success he needed Walter Grissom to believe in before signing a contract. My father's toast had started warmly enough that I'd let my guard down, which, in hindsight, was its own small mistake. He told a story about me at 6 years old, insisting on carrying my own suitcase on a family trip, even though it was nearly as big as I was. And the room laughed, genuinely, warmly, and I remember thinking for just a moment that maybe tonight would be one of the nights he managed to just be a father instead of a performance. Then he turned, glass still raised, toward Marcus's side of the room, and the warmth in his voice curdled into something else entirely. I just hope you know what you're getting, Naomi. A broke nobody in a 15-year-old truck. I built something in this town. What has he built? The room went quiet, in the specific way rooms go quiet, when everyone simultaneously decides not to react, which is its own kind of reaction. Marcus's mother's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. My own mother stared at the tablecloth, like it might rearrange itself into a different sentence if she looked hard enough. Walter Grissom, 3 tables back, laughed once, awkwardly, the laugh of a man who isn't sure whether he's supposed to. My cousin Bethany, sitting beside him, shot me a look of pure second-hand horror before quickly looking away. Nobody corrected my father. Nobody said his name. 42 people, and not one of them said a word. Marcus's father, a quiet, retired postal worker named Hal, set his own glass down slowly, deliberately, the exact way I would set mine down myself a moment later, and I saw him glance at his son with an expression that said, clearly, "I'll follow your lead on this." Marcus gave the smallest possible shake of his head, in his father's direction too. Not now, not here. The same restraint running in that family that I was only now, in this moment, fully understanding wasn't an accident. It was a choice, made deliberately, over and over, by people who had decided a long time ago that dignity mattered more than winning an argument in front of an audience. I didn't raise my voice. I set down my own glass, very deliberately, the way I've learned to do when I need my hands to be doing something other than shaking. I looked at Marcus. He looked back at me, calm in the exact way he is always calm, and gave the smallest possible shake of his head. "Not now," it said. "Not here." And I understood, the way you understand your partner in a single glance after enough years together, that we would handle this later, on our own terms, not his. I stood up instead, quietly, and said only, "Excuse me," and walked out of the banquet hall into the parking lot, where the October air had gone sharp and cold, and I stood there for a long moment before Marcus came out and found me. He didn't say anything about my father at all. He just put his jacket around my shoulders and said, "I've built exactly the life I wanted. That's enough for me. I'm sorry it's not enough for him." We didn't go back inside. We drove to his apartment instead, and I didn't sleep more than 2 hours before my own wedding. I woke up the next morning and did the thing I always do when something in my life breaks. I organized it. Not my father. Not yet. My wedding day itself. I made a short, specific list, the way I make lists at work when a case needs containing before it can be solved. Line 1. My father would walk me down the aisle because I had already decided, before the rehearsal dinner even happened, that I would not let one moment of his define the entire day for my mother, who deserved to see her daughter married without a scene attached to it. Line 2. He would not give a speech at the reception. I called the venue coordinator at 8 a.m. and quietly removed him from the toast schedule, replacing him with my maid of honor and Marcus's older brother. Line 3. I would not confront him that day at all. Whatever was coming for my father, it was not going to come on my wedding day, because my wedding day was mine, not his, and I refused to let him make it about him twice in the same 24 hours. I did all of this without raising my voice to a single person. I did not call him crying. I did not send an angry text. I simply, calmly, removed him from every moment of the day that had been built around his approval, the same way I had once quietly removed $60,000 of risk from underneath his house, without him ever noticing the math being done. The wedding itself was beautiful, and mostly untouched by the night before. My father walked me down the aisle exactly on schedule, gave my hand to Marcus, and sat down. If he noticed he wasn't giving a toast, he didn't say anything to me about it that day. I imagine he assumed it was simply a scheduling oversight. I let him believe that. Within a week of the wedding, a version of the rehearsal dinner story had made its way around both families anyway, retold with the specific softening that families do when they'd rather protect an image than sit with an ugly truth. My aunt described it, in a call to my mother, as my father having had a little too much wine and made a joke that didn't land. One cousin told me, at a post-wedding brunch, that I should let it go. That's just how your dad shows love, through teasing. Nobody used the word humiliation. Nobody used the word public. I listened to each version, said very little in response, and noticed, with the specific clarity my job has trained into me, how quickly an entire family will rewrite a fact into a personality quirk if the alternative requires holding someone accountable. My father, for his part, never apologized directly. He sent me a single text message 4 days after the wedding that read, "Hope the honeymoon planning is going well. Let's put Friday night behind us," as though Friday night were a scheduling conflict rather than a sentence he had chosen, sober enough to know exactly what he was saying, in front of 42 people. I didn't respond to the text. Marcus, when I showed it to him, just shook his head slowly and said, "That's not an apology. That's a request." He was right, the way he is usually right about things that require seeing clearly instead of kindly. I didn't argue with any of it. I didn't post anything, didn't call a family meeting, didn't ask anyone to apologize on my behalf. I simply kept a small, private note in my phone. Dates, exact wording, who was present. The same instinct that had made me good at my job for 6 years running. I wasn't building a case yet. I didn't know that yet. I was just, out of old habit, keeping the record straight in my own head, in case the day ever came when the story needed to be told accurately instead of comfortably. The discovery came 3 weeks after the wedding, on an ordinary Wednesday, and it came, as these things often do, from my own desk. Part of my role in fraud and risk compliance involves reviewing collateral documentation whenever a commercial loan renewal crosses certain risk thresholds, flagged automatically by our underwriting system, for a second set of eyes. On that Wednesday, a file landed in my queue for a construction sector loan renewal, collateral package included, borrower name redacted at the file level the way our system always does, until I opened the personal financial statement attached as a supporting guarantor document and recognized, immediately, unmistakably, my father's handwriting in the margin notes, and beneath it, his own personal bank account statements, submitted as part of the collateral file for an entirely different lender relationship than the one I'd quietly helped resolve 2 years earlier. I want to be clear about something here, because I know some of you are wondering. I did not go looking for this. I flagged the conflict of interest to my supervisor within the hour, exactly as policy requires, and formally recused myself from the file. But not before I had already seen, in the 60 seconds before I understood what I was looking at, a pattern I have spent 6 years of my career being trained to recognize on sight. Recurring transfers from an escrow-designated project account into my father's personal checking account, timed almost every month, within 48 hours of a withdrawal at a casino 2 hours away in Cherokee, North Carolina. I sat very still at my desk for what felt like a long time. My father was not simply overextended, the word I'd learned through a heating vent at 12 years old. He was, based on what I'd just seen in 60 professional, clinical seconds, moving client escrow funds, money that legally belonged to homeowners and developers who had paid Reyes Builders in advance for work not yet completed, to cover a gambling habit he had never once mentioned to my mother, to me, or, I assumed, to anyone. And the $12 million contract he was chasing from Walter Grissom, the one my wedding weekend had apparently been staged partly to help win, was not a growth opportunity. Based on the numbers I'd glimpsed, it was very possibly the only thing standing between Reyes Builders and a shortfall he could no longer quietly outrun. I want to pause here for a second, because I know some of you watching have had this exact moment happen at work, the one where an ordinary Wednesday hands you a piece of paper that quietly rearranges your entire understanding of someone you've known your whole life. There's no dramatic music in real life for that moment. There's just fluorescent lighting, a coffee going cold on your desk, and a very specific, very cold kind of stillness. That's what I had. I sat with it for exactly as long as it took to remember what my job actually requires of me, and then I did that, instead of anything else. I called my mentor at the bank, a compliance director named Diane Osei, who has spent 20 years training people like me to see exactly this kind of pattern, and told her, carefully, in general and hypothetical terms, what I'd seen and what my formal obligations were. Diane didn't comfort me. She told me the truth, the way good mentors do. If those are escrow funds being diverted for personal use, that's not a family problem anymore, Naomi. That's a regulatory one, whether or not it's your family. I appreciated that she didn't soften it. Some truths don't need softening. They need someone willing to say them plainly, once, so you can stop pretending you didn't hear them. That night, I sat in my car in my own driveway for almost 40 minutes before going inside, running the numbers again in my head, the way you run a wound with your tongue, checking whether it's really as bad as it felt the first time. It was. My father, who had stood up at my rehearsal dinner and measured another man's worth by the age of his truck, had spent nearly 2 years quietly moving other families' money meant to build their homes, to feed a habit he'd never once admitted to anyone. The $12 million contract he was chasing wasn't ambition. It was a lifeboat, and he had used my wedding weekend as part of the performance, meant to convince Walter Grissom to climb aboard it with him. I did not confront my father directly. I have learned, the hard way, in a family built on performance, that a direct confrontation simply hands someone another stage to perform on. Instead, I did what I am actually trained to do, professionally, and pointed it at my own family for the first time in my life. I formally recused myself from the file, in writing, the same day I saw it, and had no further access to it at work. But recusal doesn't erase what a person has already seen, and it doesn't remove their obligations as a private citizen with knowledge of potential fraud against consumers. I retained an attorney of my own, a careful, unhurried woman named Priya Anand, who advised me that escrow diversion in construction contracts is a serious matter, regulated at the state level, separate entirely from my employer, and that homeowners whose deposits had potentially been misused were owed protection regardless of my personal relationship to the person responsible. Over the following 2 weeks, working entirely outside my employer and entirely within my rights as a private individual, I filed a formal complaint with the state's licensing board for contractors, attaching what I was legally permitted to reference, publicly available UCC filings, the licensing board's own project disbursement requirements, and a request for a formal audit of Reyes Builders' escrow account handling on its active projects. I did not attach my father's personal bank records. I didn't need to. Regulatory audits, once triggered by a credible complaint, have their own way of finding exactly what needs finding. Priya walked me through what to expect, sitting across from me in her small downtown office, a stack of case files between us. "This will take time," she said. "Audits like this don't move fast, and your father may not even notice it's started for weeks. When it lands, it will land all at once, and it will land publicly, because licensing board findings on active commercial projects usually do." I asked her, honestly, whether I was doing the right thing, filing a complaint against my own father. She looked at me for a long moment before answering. "You're not filing a complaint against your father, Naomi. You're filing one on behalf of homeowners who paid for something they didn't get. Whether or not he's your father is a separate fact from whether or not that's true." I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count since. Priya also advised me to document, carefully and factually, my own history with the $60,000 I had quietly paid toward the credit line 2 years earlier, in case questions ever arose about my own financial involvement with the company, a precaution I hadn't thought of myself, still thinking, even then, more like a daughter than a compliance professional. I gathered the wire confirmations, the trust paperwork, dates and amounts, and gave copies to Priya to hold, just in case, she said. Everyone's paper trail matters once an audit starts pulling threads, including yours. I also, quietly, called my mother. Not to warn my father. I owed him nothing at that point. But because I could not, after everything, let her walk into what was coming without at least the truth about the house. I told her, gently but plainly, that I believed the credit line 2 years earlier had been closer to defaulting than she knew, that I had personally paid down $60,000 of it to protect her home, and that I now had reason to believe there were much larger problems in the business, that a state audit would likely surface soon. My mother was quiet on the phone for a long time. Then she said, in a voice I had never heard her use before, I always knew there was a version of the truth I wasn't being shown. I just didn't know it was this specific. She thanked me. She didn't ask me to stop. 4 days before the scheduled licensing board audit began, my father called me, the first time he'd called since the rehearsal dinner, and asked if we could put the wedding thing behind us and talk business, family to family. I told him calmly that I would be glad to talk, through my attorney, about anything related to Reyes Builders, but that I wasn't available for a conversation designed to smooth things over before an audit he didn't yet know I knew about. There was a long silence on the line. Then he hung up. The reckoning didn't happen in a courtroom, and it didn't happen at a second dinner. It happened at the exact venue my father had chosen to showcase his own success. A groundbreaking ceremony, 3 weeks after the audit began, for the very $12 million mixed-use project he had been courting Walter Grissom for, since before my wedding. My father had insisted, over the objections of his own project manager, that the groundbreaking be a public event, press invited, a local news crew filming for the 6 o'clock segment, because he needed more than ever for Reyes Builders to look exactly as solid as he'd always performed it to be. I found out about the event almost by accident, the way most of this story unfolded. Priya mentioned, during a routine update call, that Walter Grissom's attorney had reached out seeking confirmation of the timeline I'd referenced in my complaint, since the audit's preliminary findings had apparently already reached his desk through channels neither of us fully controlled. Priya advised me it would be useful, procedurally, for me to be present at the public event and available if questions arose about the collateral history I'd disclosed regarding my mother's house. I hadn't planned on going. I hadn't planned on ever setting foot near Reyes Builders again, honestly. But something in me, the same something that had once quietly wired $60,000 into a credit line without asking for credit, wanted to see, with my own eyes, whether the truth would actually hold up in the daylight, in public, the one place my father had always seemed untouchable. I was not invited, and I did not attend intending to make a scene. I stood near the back of the small crowd, in a gray coat, holding nothing but my phone, and watched my father take the podium exactly the way he'd taken every podium of my childhood, shoulders back, chin up, voice pitched for an audience rather than a conversation. My father stood at a small podium, gold shovel in hand, mid-sentence about 30 years of building trust in this community, when a man in a plain suit, an auditor from the state licensing board, there at Walter Grissom's own request, after his attorney had flagged irregularities in the escrow disclosures submitted for the new project, stepped forward and asked, on camera, whether Reyes Builders would like to address the active state audit into escrow account handling before the ceremony proceeded. The news camera, already rolling for the groundbreaking, caught the entire exchange. My father's smile did the exact thing it had done at my rehearsal dinner when the room went quiet. It stayed on his face a half-second too long, the way a smile does when the person wearing it hasn't caught up to what their own face is doing yet. He said, quickly, that it was a standard review, nothing unusual, and reached for the shovel again. Walter Grissom, standing 3 feet away in a navy suit, did not reach for his own shovel. He said, evenly, loud enough for the microphone to catch, "Gerald, I was told this morning that escrow disbursements on my last project with your company don't match the draw schedule. I'd like an answer before we break ground on a second one." The crowd, which had been polite and restless a moment earlier, went completely still. I didn't step forward. I didn't need to. Priya had already told me the paperwork would speak for itself, and it did. My father tried, for perhaps 30 seconds, to redirect the moment back toward the performance he'd planned, gesturing at the crowd, saying something about getting back to celebrating. But Walter Grissom simply repeated his question, calmly, the way you repeat a question to someone you've already decided isn't going to answer it honestly. "Where did the escrow money go, Gerald?" A woman near the front, one of the homeowners from an earlier Reyes Builders project, whose name I recognized from the audit paperwork, said, quietly but clearly enough to carry, "I'd like to know that too." A few heads turned. My father's project manager, standing near the trucks, wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. The news camera kept rolling, the way news cameras do exactly when you'd most like them not to. My father looked, for one long moment, directly at me, standing near the back of that crowd in my gray coat, and something in his face changed. Not anger, exactly, more like the specific recognition of a person realizing the audience has stopped believing the show. He didn't answer Walter Grissom's question on camera. He set the gold shovel down on the podium, said something quiet to his project manager, and walked toward his truck without another word to the crowd, the news camera following him the entire way, capturing the exact kind of silent, ordinary exit that says more than any speech could have. 2 days later, in a company-wide email that somehow reached local press within hours, Reyes Builders confirmed it was cooperating fully with a state licensing board audit into escrow account practices. Walter Grissom's firm formally withdrew from the $12 million project the same week. Over the following 4 months, the fallout arranged itself the way these things always eventually do, not with a scene, just with paperwork, closing in line by line. The state licensing board's audit confirmed a pattern of escrow fund diversions across 3 active Reyes Builders projects, totaling just over $310,000, traced through account records to a recurring pattern of casino withdrawals in Cherokee, North Carolina, spanning nearly 2 years. My father surrendered his contractor's license as part of a settlement that avoided criminal prosecution on the condition of full restitution to the affected homeowners and a formal repayment plan. Reyes Builders, the company he had spent 30 years building his entire identity around, was formally dissolved 11 weeks after the groundbreaking ceremony that was supposed to be its biggest win. My parents sold the house same house I had quietly protected 2 years earlier, not because the credit line defaulted this time, but because my father needed the equity to make restitution, and there was, finally, nothing left to perform around. The homeowners whose escrow funds had been diverted received full restitution within the settlement timeline, a detail I followed closely, quietly, through the public case filings, because it mattered to me more than almost anything else in the outcome that the people my father had actually harmed were made whole. Walter Grissom's firm went on to hire a different contractor for the mixed-use project, one recommended, somewhat to my surprise, by Diane's husband, who worked in commercial real estate. I heard, secondhand, that the new groundbreaking went smoothly, with no cameras catching anything but a shovel and dirt. My mother moved into a small apartment near her sister's place outside of town. She calls me most Sundays now, and we don't talk about my father much, though she did tell me, once, that she felt lighter than she had in years, which she said with the specific surprise of someone who hadn't realized how heavy the performance had been until it finally stopped. She sold the oversized car he'd bought her all those years ago and replaced it with a small, practical sedan she picked out entirely on her own. She told me it was the first car she'd ever chosen herself, and she cried a little saying it, and I understood exactly why. My own life, in the same 4 months, kept doing exactly what it had been quietly doing all along, building itself steadily, without needing an audience. I was promoted to lead compliance analyst that winter, a role Diane Osei had been quietly grooming me for, since long before any of this happened. Marcus finished the custom cedar dining table he'd been building for our new place, since before the wedding, the same wood his ring box had come from, and we hosted our first holiday dinner on it, with his parents and mine, my mother, not my father, sitting at either end. If you're still with me, I'm guessing some part of this feels familiar. A family that measured worth in appearances, a person you love getting underestimated out loud by someone who should have known better, the specific, quiet work of protecting people who have no idea they're being protected. I'm not going to tell you it feels good, watching a parent's whole identity come apart in public. It doesn't. Not entirely. What it does is finally match the story to the numbers. I still think, sometimes, about the version of that night where my father simply gave the toast he'd given me at 6 years old, the one about the suitcase, and sat down without ever turning toward Marcus's side of the room. I think about whether, in that version, I would have ever pulled the thread on the credit line, or the escrow accounts, or any of it, whether I would have kept quietly protecting a performance for another 10 years, the way my mother had for 30. I don't know the answer. I only know that the version that actually happened gave all of us, my mother included, a chance to stop paying for someone else's image with our own quiet, unspoken labor. A year to the day after the rehearsal dinner, Marcus and I hosted a small anniversary dinner at that same cedar table, and I caught myself running my hand along the grain, the way I used to run my hand along the edge of his handmade ring box before he ever proposed. The same wood, the same steady hands, the same quiet kind of worth that never once needed a toast to prove itself. My father built something that looked solid for 30 years. Marcus built something that actually was, for a fraction of the noise. if you've ever had someone judge the person you love without knowing the first thing about what they'd actually built. You already know that the truth doesn't need you to defend it loudly. It only needs time and the right set of numbers to speak for itself. Family isn't the people who perform love the loudest. It's the people who show up quietly and keep showing up long after anyone's watching. If this story hit close to home, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Tell me in the comments what you would have done at that rehearsal dinner. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe to Home of Secrets. There's always another ledger waiting to be balanced.